You know, the concept isn't that complex. We're a large city, 250,000 inhabitants, enough. If the city were split into 4 districts, each of the districts would probably have more residents in it than most cities, whole cities have in California. Campaigns for city council have become too expensive. With a city that large, it's very difficult to communicate. You're having to raise very large sums of money in order to communicate with the electorate. And that becomes a problem. Not everybody is able to compete in that kind of a race. And so the types of candidates that you're going to get for those sorts of races are going to be different than if you had a more localized, smaller race. And fundamentally, the biggest reason that I think district elections are necessary in Chula Vista is that you're going to be giving neighborhoods a stronger voice at City Hall. You're going to be able to make individual council members more accountable to the interests of those neighborhoods. And fundamentally, I think that's more important than just about anything. I mean, the argument in favor of Proposition B, it talks about candidates being more informed. I mean, I think that there's a certain amount of truth to that. I mean, it's not the big reason, because I think your council members really get informed on city-wide issues, but being from coming from a district, from a smaller geographic area, it certainly allows you to have a closer connection with residents. It's easier, and council members could be more accessible to their community through smaller districts. And I think that's where the real value is, in being able to understand the hopes and dreams and sentiments of your constituents, as opposed to representing a much broader group, a much larger group that really allows or creates a condition where individual political leaders could be less attached to those constituencies. I mean, the perfect example is Washington, D.C., in Congress, and even at the state level. You know, you're not that connected. The districts and the areas are so large, and these folks are so far away that it's very difficult to see sometimes the connection to the local constituency. And so what's happening in a larger city, in a growing city like Chula Vista, is sort of a microcosm of that same problem. The issue of being, it's true, I mean, now to run citywide, in a citywide election, for you to really get a message out and inform the voters about who you are and what you believe is much more difficult. You have to raise very large sums of money. I mean, you can imagine, you've all received some of those mailers around election time. You've probably gotten some already. They're very expensive. In a citywide race, they're probably $25,000 or $30,000. I mean, think of how many campaign contributions you need to get in order to compete. And more importantly, what's happened in recent times is that it's so difficult to compete at that level that you see candidates receiving most of their funding through independent expenditures and through party communications and those sorts of avenues. And so that, I think, skews the process, makes it less democratic and easier for people with deep pockets to win elections, as opposed to people who are connected to a community. I mean, certainly in the experience of San Diego, and I've had the conversations with folks there, you know, there are citywide issues, budget issues, for example, that everybody needs to consider and weigh, whether you're from a particular district or not. And so those issues, they're not localized. They're not. I mean, those aren't the sorts of issues that are, you know, you know, particular to a district necessarily. And you know, the sort of input that council members get from the public, I think is valuable in the veracity of the argument and the rationale. and not because it serves, you know, one parochial need versus another. And so I believe that to be a red herring argument. It's not materialized in any way that I've seen in other cities that have districts. And so I think that you will be heard equally when people step before the mic at a city council meeting. Whatever it is you're saying and the importance of what you're saying is what is most important. And so I think that'll continue. I don't think that'll change. I think you're more likely to get more candidates in a smaller election because you don't need to raise large sums of money. You don't have to walk an entire city. You can win an election on shoe leather within a smaller district, and so I think you're more likely to get more candidates, and so there's a less likelihood that would occur with the district elections, I think, than a citywide election. I think the question went to how, if wouldn't it be easier to buy election because you have this smaller district, less money, could be more influential, I think was the point of the question. And I don't think that's the case, because what happens is that money matters less. In a smaller district, money matters less, because it doesn't matter if your opponent is able to send 10 mail pieces versus your 2. If the people in your district have greater access and have better information about the person and the things that you propose to do as an elected official, that I think outweighs any, you know, the money. It's a counterbalance to the money, and that's the whole point, is to try to take money out. And so money, although more of it could flow into a smaller area, is less important. It's less significant in a district.
I'll tell you that Proposition B limits your voting power. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, and surely you don't want to limit your right to have a say in each council seat. Prop B says you will be able to vote for one candidate, not 4. And today you vote for city council every 2 years. But Prop B says you get to vote once every 4 years. Prop B doesn't give you any more representation. It splits the city up into smaller districts. You might see your council member in a grocery store more often because he or she lives in your district, but he or she is going to be one among 60,000 residents. And if your council member prefers to shop across town, well, will a smaller voting district mean more doors being knocked on by council candidates during election season? Perhaps, but it's also quite possible that the value of that door knocking makes a lesser of an impression because it's easier to raise money to influence an election one seat at a time by spending concentrated amounts of money. Just as an example, there was an independent expenditure this last primary in which the spender and his wife spent almost $48,000 in an independent expenditure to oppose one council member in June and support a candidate who's also a signer in favor of Prop B. And for me, that's just a little too close for comfort. District elections are expensive. Prop B requires taxpayers to pay for drawing district boundaries in 2013, again in 2021, and once every 10 years after. Prop B could cost the voters of this city $400,000 between 2013 and 2021, money that could be used for road repairs, not for politicians. And here's how that math works. First, you set aside $6,500 to $10,500 per election cycle. And every time you have an election, that's referred to an election cycle. So a June election or a November election, in a 4-year span, you have 6 possible elections. 4 council members, 1 mayor, and 1 city attorney. So Prop B says that he or she who wins with over 50% of the vote in June has to run again in November. No other California city asks that. So there's another $6,500 to $10,500 times 6. Remember, it's 4 council candidates, a mayor, and a city attorney. Then repeat that in the next 4-year cycle times 6. and add the amount of money that's going to cost to draw those district elections. City of San Diego just spent $500,000 drawing their elections. And if you made the argument that the city of Chula Vista is smaller than the city of San Diego, well, call it 10%. $50,000 is still a lot of money. And you'd have to do it in 2013 and in 2021 and every 10 years after. Less than 10 years, the voters are now socked with almost $400,000 in costs. And for what benefit? Prop B politicizes a system that is certain to create dissent. With district elections, the city's best interests are not treated as a whole. They're undermined because of battles between people running for different geographic districts. Prop B is going to generate pressure to draw candidate favorable district boundaries, and if that weren't the case, then today's incumbents wouldn't be affected. But it doesn't. If Proposition B passes, it gives incumbent council members a pass. So speaking of dissent, many of us on the council, myself included, know that we should treat one another with respect. That's the disagree without being disagreeable. And that's before dividing Chula Vista into districts. So, for example, touchy subject that it is, Mr. Ramirez recently told a UT reporter that I kept my car allowance, that I'm proud of it, and I'm not bashful talking about it. Well, where'd you get that? It's an allowable expense. It's not calculated on how far you drive from home to City Hall, and I would think you would want me not to be bashful when asked about it. Be straightforward, be candid, be honest. Well, Prop B is not straightforward. It's complicated and it's time-consuming. This is not a matter of drawing an X from northeast to southwest and from southeast to northwest. 5 or 10 years from now, when we have so much more building out to the east, will council members who are elected east of La Media, not 805, but east of La Media, be concerned with the oldest areas of town when they're elected from just one district? Will someone elected from an area where curbs and gutters and sidewalks have not yet been put in place empathize with the conditions that exist in the newer areas? After all, they're going to get older too. It takes 3 votes to change a rule or institute a new one, and Prop B, you get just 1 vote. Well, then there's horse trading. It's also called vote trading. Here's how it works. One council member votes for someone else's issue in exchange for a vote on theirs. So District X council member votes for a tennis court in District Y's district in exchange for District Y council member voting for a skateboard park in District X. Big cities are notorious for doing this. When council members are elected by the entire city, it is more likely that votes will be based on merit and in the best interest of the city, not on backroom political alliances. Finally, Proposition B is anti-democratic. It requires candidates who receive over 50% of the vote in a June election, otherwise winning the election, to run again in November. As I said before, no California city does this. The state legislature does, but since when are we holding up the state legislature as an example of the way to run politics? This means paying for a second election when the first election was already won. Prop B pretends to be about election reform. Instead, it concentrates power and it games the system. So look, we're all in this together. This is our city. I think that we can remain unified as a city, that when we take our disagreements, that we talk about them and we share everybody's concerns in a public forum where everybody has the same vote and the people who elected us elect us as a city. I think Prop B wastes time, it wastes money, and I'm voting against it, and I hope you will too.
Because as you heard, the mayor went through a list of potential possible costs associated with it, but you know, none of them will happen for sure, and they're very likely not to happen. Because the city doesn't have that kind of money to spend on these sorts of things. Redistricting in a city like Chula Vista is completely different than a city like San Diego. The city of Chula Vista is in the shape of an egg, basically. And dividing the city north, south, east, and west is something that could be generated through a computer program. And if it's just based on that criteria, north, south, east, west, using population to balance out the districts, there shouldn't be any discussion, no heavy committee work of any sort. And so, although it appears to be an effective scare tactic to tell people that district elections are going to cost these, hundreds of thousands of dollars, there isn't any real proof that or evidence that that'll happen in Chula Vista. And secondly, when elections occur and the registrar of voters prints pamphlets for each of those elections, it charges the city an amount of money equal to the cost of mailing to the number of voters. When it sends pamphlets to smaller districts, smaller number of voters, we've estimated, the city's estimated, we'll save about $30,000 an election cycle. And so those are real savings right right off the top. And so the real potential is that district elections will cost less money in Chula Vista than if you than citywide races. And I think that was probably it. And it's interesting to hear the mayor speak about costs and then talk about car allowances. The issue of car allowances came up many years ago, and that really had to do with the type of leadership that needed to come from the top in Chula Vista. It was at a time when year after year we were cutting budgets, cutting city staff wages, cutting benefits, and it seemed that the proper thing to do for many of us was to lead by example and to take the first hit. And so for the record, I did not take my car allowance, and I asked that money be used for the library and animal control facility. And so it did not come back to my budget to be reallocated for other things, other expenditures that I might have. And so that's really what that's about. And it was an important thing, I think, that our city leadership needed to do.